Awesome. So yeah, there's obviously we started at sort of global level with Dunstan, with Melanie, shared some insights on what the local governments are doing, and now let's get even deeper, talking about charging infrastructure and sort of retrofitting of existing apartment buildings when it comes to electric vehicle charging. It's been a hot topic. People living in apartments don't have access to easy charging due to Strata and other requirements and myths and other things. So we'll get to learn more about it from Damien Moran. So yeah, give him a round of applause.
Thank you. I'll just set my timer so that I stick to the right amount of time. So thank you. I'm from a company called Energy-Tec. We do energy billing, meter reading and billing, and we generate a lot of the utility statements and reports that people use to pay their electricity accounts. We also do a lot of feasibility work in solar and EV implementation in commercial buildings and strata assets. So I'm here to talk about the implementation of EV systems into multi-dwelling apartments. I'll just get this onto the next slide. So I'll be talking a little bit about trends and challenges. Most you'll know because I understand most of the people in the room are EV advocates. A little bit about charging integration into multi-unit dwellings, which is a predominant component, and then some key messages. So most of you would know how cheap it is to charge your EV in comparison to charging or fueling up an ICE vehicle. What we know is that about 1 in 5 Australians live in strata. In Western Australia, that's 75,000 strata complexes, and about 50% of all complexes new building approvals are strata. So there's a growing percentage that's happening. So this is very much a hot topic, obviously. That one. So the big ticket item when I'm speaking to strata schemes is the demographic. You've got the early adopters and you've got the conservative people, and a lot of the issues are that the larger consumers, most of the schemes, they want surety that there's an equitable solution when you're implementing an EV system, and of course the early adopters want access to charging. What's happening is we're seeing that bylaws are being introduced to sort of put a hold on the implementation of EV charging, which is not good. And what needs to happen is the educational process is what needs to be improved and rolled out more expediently to empower people to know the truth and know what's happening. So what do we look at? I'm going to highlight a couple of challenges. That was the first challenge, that there's this a little bit of mistrust of that the outcome might not be equitable for all parties. The second is that capacity in properties is a risk item. We all know that buildings are effectively designed to to provide electricity to the asset for the purpose of occupying a home, car parks and lifts and those sorts of things when it comes to strata or multi-unit dwellings. And every building has its limit of actual available power. And so when we're working through these audits, we often identify certain sites that have plenty of spare capacity, and we find others that only have limits, that have limits to that capacity. And that's where it comes back to that equitable solution, is establishing that capacity to determine how much work needs to be done now how many EVs can be rolled out safely without hitting that limit. And of course there's load balancing, which can be the solution for this, but I'll talk about that shortly. So something that's not well known in the sort of general public is that there are multiple ways that electricity is purchased in Western Australia. There's two predominant models, and one is known as the multi-master model, and the other is what's called an embedded network. The multi-master model will be if you live in a strata and you have a Synergy retailer account. Synergy is your customer. That's where you're procuring electricity from Synergy via a Western Power owned meter installed into the privately owned assets infrastructure. Okay, so that model means that you're procuring electricity via Synergy and the scheme, the individual lot owners have separate agreements or separate accounts for that electricity supply. The embedded network version is where a single meter point, which is owned by Western Power, is the source of the account for the whole of site. And that allows the complex to procure electricity through the deregulated electricity market in Western Australia, which is where a site uses more than 50,000 kilowatt hours, or the equivalent of about 10 large homes, or approximately 20 apartments. So that model is actually financially very beneficial for schemes because they can basically procure electricity at a rate that is under a supply agreement, and then they can apply the equivalent tariff that the synergy aligned with the synergy tariff, which is actually legislated as well. They're not allowed to charge any more than that. Oops, I've gone past one. So it's all about planning and understanding that infrastructure. So it's all about understanding those limitations, understanding the capacity of the asset, understanding your procurement arrangements, and understanding the legislation. And in the Strata sector, there's a Strata Act, and you've got to comply to that Strata Act, and that's where the bylaws for the individual properties would be defined, and you've got to start considering the budgeting, and that's where we head into the discussion around feasibilities. So those considerations are, what is the current billing setup? For example, if you are in a multi-master environment where you're receiving your utility account from Synergy, the infrastructure for the car park will be separate, and the arrangements for that billing will need to be a separate undertaking. If it's an embedded network, you can actually combine the electricity account for your EV charger plus your apartment into the one retailer account, which is very efficient from a cost billing perspective, which can be a very affordable way of approaching it for the schemes. That condition of electrical infrastructure, often when you're looking at the infrastructure of assets for feasibilities, retrospective work has to be done on that infrastructure. It might be tired, it might be out of date, and that means you've got to invest money and time into ascertaining what needs to be done to bring it up to a compliance level. And that's because ultimately, in many cases, a Western Power application may be required as part of the project works. We've talked about electricity capacity limitations. The layout of the infrastructure is very important. Often there's provisioning made in buildings which makes it affordable and quite efficient to connect to those suppliers. There's spare connection points, for example, but if a property doesn't have those spare connection points, you can run into issues where the cost increases because you've got to deploy additional infrastructure. And the ownership structure of car parks. In some cases, the structure of of Strata means that every owner of an apartment may own a car bay or multiple car bays. But there are also examples where the scheme owns the car bay. So the solutions vary subject to the configuration of that Strata scheme. So there's just some high-level steps in relation to starting with doing a feasibility to ascertain all those high-level elements to get that equitable solution, rolling into a design phase which would roll into an implementation plan, rolling through a range of schemes and approvals which relate to, they can be anything from Western Power approvals, they can be scheme approvals, and then rolling into what is a cyclic billing process so that ongoing process is efficient. And sometimes that bit's forgotten. It's all about getting it installed, but the work into actually managing and equitably allocating that end-use consumption is not identified. And we all know that EVs are going to be using just as much as an apartment on every given night. Effectively, if you look at it like that, it's basically doubling the consumption and doubling the energy use of the property, of course. So I've got some high-level bits about what we go through with our feasibility studies. It's that condition review. It's the access to charging for that accessibility. Some schemes don't want EVs for everywhere. They might want it in certain locations, as much as visitor locations aren't always the best because they're soaking up space that non-EV chargers compete with, so that can be an issue. The fire risk is obviously something that's a concern for many, especially in the multi-level apartments with car parks with low heights and things, and other assets. For example, gas lines that are running across buildings and bits and pieces that have to be thought through, and access for fire, and also isolation points that are nice and visible in the event of a fire, so that you can safely shut down that feed, and it's very obvious to do so. Whereas sometimes the ad hoc one-off installations don't cover off those sorts of security issues or give comfort to the schemes. Electrical connection of hardware and all that sort of site. That's basically, you know, there's lots of suppliers out there, and there are lots of installers, and there's some funds available these days. City of Perth put a grant process out, which was fantastic recently, which was for the feasibilities. And that meant that people could roll out the feasibilities and understand that, and that was funded up to $10,000, which was fantastic. And they've got another rollout for some asset installation. So they're leading the way when it comes to local government, which has been really good and has driven a lot of those feasibilities to be rolled out. Some of those elements about charge times, you know, giving people those options. Do they want a slow, medium or a fast charge solution? Often the slow charge is the most practical for assets that don't have a lot of capacity, whereas the fast charge might be more suitable if a scheme has access to a public space and can deploy a fast charge asset out in the field and earn a revenue from it. This is the key to understand, that property owners have the right. They own the car parks, they own the solar roofs, and it should be their right in the first instance to be able to deploy those assets and generate an income to supplement the cost and the investment and gain that return on investment on those assets. So this is just a high-level list of what an embedded network, a master network and third-party ownership looks like, because there are some instances where schemes, developers produce buildings where they sell the metering assets to somebody else to operate and sell the electricity on their behalf. And that model means that the scheme owner doesn't have the choice to convert to an embedded network, or they're not receiving their billing directly from Synergy. It's a third option. What is very obvious these days is that he or she who owns the meter owns the income. And the same thing applies to the solar assets, and the same thing applies to the EV charges. If a property owner maintains control of those assets, they can derive the income. So some of the best practice models to mitigate, this is all part of mitigating rising energy costs. If you've got solar assets and you've got an embedded network, you can actually offset that solar generation into your EV charging. Unfortunately, if you don't have an embedded network in multi-dwelling, it's limited to what the either the common area systems can service, or EV, which still makes it totally justifiable. I've got 3 minutes. Supplementing with renewables is something that the Energy Transition Plan for Western Australia wants, the state government, and wants property owners to invest in solar and to deploy that. But they do have some challenges with the capacity, obviously, at certain times of the year and certain times of the day. Saving or generating income is a big topic, and that's really where, if you're procuring that electricity right, you can save money, and if you're on selling it to consumers, you can make money, acknowledging that the schemes have that decision. The scheme are empowered to on-sell that energy at the discounted rate. They don't have to charge it at the gazetted tariff. It's their choice. And often there's the outsourcing of billing, which is often done. That's what a company like us does. But there's also certain entities that do that internally as well. So verify, comply is all about that design. Baseline inclusions should be that the electrical integration, that you should really think that through. Make sure that design of that switchboard that services the car park is well designed, that the labelling and the accessibility to all that equipment is well labelled. Thinking about fire mitigation and where you might leave signs and really clear guides for the fire services if there was ever an instance. And as much as we know that is not a high risk, this is all about giving people surety that these solutions are in place, and means that if anything did happen, that there's a solution for them. Load management and load balancing is a big topic item. It's very much about when you deploy a solution for an asset that you're consistent with the EV charging devices and that they all communicate with each other. That's how the systems can all talk to each other and achieve a successful load balancing solution. If you go a bespoke solution where a scheme allows individual owners to deploy different devices, ultimately if you want to integrate all those, they don't talk to each other. And then you end up with trouble. So that's that importance of doing that feasibility up front and landing on an appropriate solution from the beginning. And tying into the metering and billing solution is the key. If that EV charging solution can be integrated into the existing billing, it's going to be cheaper. There is quite a bit to do with approvals with this process. The schemes have AGMs and EGMs every year, and they only happen once a year. Special EGMs have to be formed often, so the process is slow. It has to be acknowledged that it's slow, and we all need to be patient with that process. And there's a lot to it, and it's basically it's voting by it's majority rules. So it's very important to approach these with a very conservative approach and make sure that that equitable solution is delivered, which can be very hard when you're an early adopter because you want to see it happen, and I can relate to that. But it's very important that all elements of the demographic understand, because ultimately the whole scheme needs to fund this, and it might initially be for the benefit of a small few, acknowledging that it's going to be ultimately for the benefit of the majority if this rollout occurs the way that we're all hoping it does. And there's also funding options. There's banks that fund these assets these days, Macquarie and others. There's dedicated funding tools, and the Strata sector is very popular for very reliable for funding. There's very few defaults, which is why banks like Macquarie like it, which is very good. I'm on the board of the Strata Communities Australia Association in WA as well, and I advocate for energy policy for that organisation as well. And that's that compete about that ability to procure electricity and on-sell it at those right tariffs. And systems, when it comes to that operational, EV systems, when set up and operated well, can self-fund the entire life cycle of these assets, including the maintenance of that equipment and all the billing services. It funds itself. If you think about what you pay for electricity out on the street versus what you pay for electricity in your home, we all know it's more efficient, cheaper to procure at home, and that gives schemes the choice to possibly align those fees or leave them the same. It's their decision. And that's a really great thing, because it means that's equitable. It's also affordable. It keeps it affordable for the especially some of the marginal elements of society, and especially some of those who live in strata schemes, possibly even in state government-owned property. I think that's about it. So the last bit was understanding your scheme's current billing setup. Start planning. Think about adopting those bylaws. There's lots of information about those these days available. Review those risks and make sure they're clearly addressed. And our recommendation is retain full ownership where you can. That's it. Thank you.